Hey class, so we talked about how energy can flow through an ecosystem, how carbon and nitrogen can cycle through the ecosystem, and we're going to continue to explore that as we think about, sort of tie all that together as we talk about the processes that organisms use to produce energy through cellular respiration and photosynthesis. All right, here we go. So we're going to kind of combine a couple of activities 9 through 12, and we'll just call it the photosynthesis and cellular respiration shuffle. So as we've talked about energy, we talked about producers and how they can produce their own, convert sunlight to produce their own chemical energy. So they're going to take sunlight, water, carbon dioxide. They're going to use the process of photosynthesis and ultimately produce glucose and oxygen. Well, that glucose and oxygen plays a role and helps power organisms that are using cellular respiration, consumers that need to take in that chemical energy in the form of glucose and process it, and then ultimately a byproduct, the products of that reaction are water and carbon dioxide, which you can see feed back into photosynthesis. So we get into this cycle, this circular loop here, where the reactants and the products of the reactions are critical for one another. So make sure you read through the review. It gives you a little more information and some really nice definitions of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. But as we think about photosynthesis, we talked about producers, so this lowest level, and that's where our photosynthesis is going to occur. Those are the organisms that are going to take in that sunlight and create that chemical energy through sugars. And then our consumers ultimately will take in the energy from those producers, and they will utilize it in cellular respiration. Just another diagram sort of showing the cycle and the process, and how they loop and continue feed into each other, and so it's critical that those remain in balance. And what we're going to sort of explore today is what happens if those the balances of those change. What if we change the level of CO2? How does that affect photosynthesis and ultimately cellular respiration as we work around the cycle? So we're going to kind of explore this question: how do carbon and oxygen cycle through the environment? So we used a virtual lab where we were going to, the premise was that we got some snails that were going to grow in an aquarium, but they also gave us these plants, and so we weren't sure if we really needed to grow the plants, and so we wanted to test why we might need why we might need plants in this ecosystem. So if we set up our reaction, what we're going to do is we're going to use a chemical indicator called bromethymol blue that will change colors depending on the pH and the level of CO2 in solution. So in neutral pH water, sort of our standard water, it will be green, which means there's a medium level of CO2. If CO2 levels decrease, then we will get a blue color, and if CO2 levels increase, then we see a yellow color that forms. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these tubes and we're going to add different numbers of plants and snails. We're going to adjust those independent variables, and we're going to figure out what the right balance might be and if we really need to have those plants growing in our aquarium. So here is a data table. So if you look in the procedure for this activity, if you scroll down a bit in it, there is a data table like this that you can fill in. You'll see that we're going to start, this is going to be our control, so it's going to have the indicator, but it's not going to have any snails or plants, and that just helps us to see what happens in the system if we don't add anything. So you'll see the contents of the tubes, the starting color of the indicator, and then there's a spot where you can predict your color. So if you haven't had a chance, go in, think about what you think is going to happen to CO2 levels depending on the organisms that are there, thinking about which ones are going to do photosynthesis and which ones are going to utilize cellular respiration. And then we'll record our end color when we finish the experiment. So we set up our tubes according to our procedure there. One important note is that we put stoppers in these. We need it to be a closed system. Since we want to measure a gas, if we left the test tubes open, that gas would be able to escape out and we wouldn't get an accurate reading of the levels in our tubes. So then what we're going to do is we're going to take one set of tubes, we're going to put them under this grow light for 24 hours, and then we'll put another set of tubes in the dark because we want to see if having light is an important part of our aquarium system as well. So after the 24 hours, if we come back, we take a look. So we see that if we look at the ones in the light first, we see that our control tube did not change. The tube with just plants turned blue. The tube with a balance of plants and snails stayed green, and then with just snails, we turned yellow. If we look at what happened in the dark, we see that the first tube turned green, or stayed green because it's our control. In the presence of just plants, we stayed green as well. Now in 3 and 4, both turned yellow. So just writing that out in words, you would have had a data table that looks something like this. And so then the question becomes, what does that mean? Well, now we're starting to think about which ones are going to perform cellular respiration, which ones are going to do photosynthesis. So our snails would be utilizing cellular respiration. So they're going to take in glucose and oxygen, and they're going to give off CO2. So if we add CO2, then we would expect the solution to turn more yellow. So if we look at the tube with just snails, that's what we see. We see it turning yellow because the snails are giving off CO2. The plants are going to take in the CO2 and they're going to give off oxygen. And so in a tube with just plants, what we see is that CO2 is utilized, and so we end up with a blue color because there's no more CO2 left in the solution. In this tube that we grew in the light, we have this nice balance. We were able to, while our snails were giving off CO2, our plants were utilizing it. That means that our plants would be giving off oxygen that our snails could use, and we would continue in that cycle. If we put the tubes in the dark, we see a little bit of a different result. So again, our control stays green. Now with our plants, we're staying green. So no CO2 has been given off. Why is that? Well, we know from our discussion of photosynthesis that sunlight is critical for that to happen. Without sunlight, there would be no photosynthesis. And so these plants actually don't produce any carbon dioxide because they're not photosynthesizing. As a result, even in this tube where we have one plant and one snail, there's no photosynthesis occurring, so CO2 is not being utilized, and so this snail doing cellular respiration would be giving off CO2, and we'd have the yellow color, and we see that same result here again. So what roles do the photosynthesis and cellular respiration have in an ecosystem? They play a critical role in balancing the dissolved oxygen levels, because we need oxygen for those organisms that perform cellular respiration. But then we also need CO2 levels for organisms that are going to photosynthesize. And so having those in balance is a critical part of having the ecosystem work. We can see again from our figure, if for some reason any of these was disrupted, then we would change this balance and ultimately could affect the health of the ecosystem. So if we think about some of the examples we've looked at where we had eutrophication, we're bringing in nutrients, all of a sudden plankton overgrows. Now our producers, which were often aquatic plants, in the examples we looked at, are unable to grow. So now they're not producing the oxygen that's dissolved in the water, and so then organisms that need that oxygen to perform cellular respiration are unable to survive, and then you get a result like Chesapeake Bay and the crab jubilees, where we have all these dead zones. So just revisiting our challenge, hopefully you can now start to see how carbon and oxygen cycle through the environment and how the balance of those is super important. Hopefully that gives you some information and a good idea of how cellular respiration and photosynthesis are working in an ecosystem, how the balance is critical, and how an imbalance can lead to some of the sustainability challenges we've seen. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you back in class.